Okay, part one, notes on graphing. So we're going to talk about graphing lines and absolute value today. And for both of those, we need a little bit of a slope reminder real quick. So first, if you have to graph a positive slope, you are going to try to go either up and right or down and left. And that is because both up and right have the same sign and down and left have the same sign. So when you go both of those directions, you'll be going in a positive direction for your line. If you want to do a negative slope, so you have a negative m value, then you're going to go up and left or down and right, and that is because they have opposite directions, so your overall slope will be negative. Okay. All right, let's talk about graphing lines. So if you remember, there's three different kinds of lines. We talked a little bit about them when we were writing equations. Slope-intercept form, point-slope form, and standard form. Slope-intercept and point-slope, you're going to graph pretty much the same way. You're just going to start in different places. So for slope-intercept form, we're going to start on the y-axis with that be y-intercept value. So I just made a random one here. So any random y-intercept value that is in the equation, that would be the n number, you're going to plot that on that y-axis here in the middle. Then from that y-intercept point, you're going to graph the slope up and right, or down and left, or up and left and down and right, whichever way it tells you to go. And that will give you your second point. Remember, you only need 2 points to graph a line. So we started with our b value on the y-axis, and then we used our slope to plot that second point, and then we can draw our line. With our point slope form, you're going to do pretty much the exact same thing, except you're going to start on a random point that is not on the y-axis. So whatever point is in the equation in the x1, y1 spots will be the point that you graph. And then from there, you're going to use your slope to go up and right, up and left, down and left, whatever slope you have, and that will give you your second point, and then you're going to draw a line. So let's take a look at two equations for that. So if we look at this first equation for slope-intercept form, we have 4/3 x plus 4. That tells me my y-intercept is 4 and my slope is 4/3. So first I'm going to graph on my y-axis that 4 point, and that 4 will be graphed right up here. And then from there, I'm going to use the slope of 4/3. Now that's a positive slope, so I can either go up 4, right 3, or down 4, left 3. Now, if I'm starting at this pink point, I clearly cannot go up 4 spaces because that's off the graph. So instead, I'm going to choose the down 4, left 3 point or slope and go down 4, left 3 to make my second point down here. Draw a line in between them, and there's the line that you're trying to graph. Over here, if you take a look at our point slope form, remember we're going to do the same with our slope, but because we don't have a y-intercept, we have two values. We first have to find this point, 2, 3, as our starting point. The 2 from here and the 3 from here. My apologies, that should be backwards. 3, 2. Now I'm going to have to change my whole graph. So while we're doing this, let's talk about the fact that 3, 2 comes from that point or those values by the x and y value, but they are opposites of what's in the parentheses. So we have -3 or x minus 3, so that's really a positive 3 point. And we have y minus 2, so that's really a positive 2 point. So when I have -3 and -2, that gives me the point 3, 2. So my apologies there, 3, 2. Here we go. All right, so then I'm going to take my slope. I'm still going to go down 4 and left 9. So there we go, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 3, 4, 5, 6. So now my new point is going to be way over here. So there's just a little change on that. So there's my slope, down 4 and left 9. And then I'll draw my line in between those 2 points right there. All right, so there we go. First point, graph my slope, and then that gives me my line. So again, tricky part here is finding that point. Notice that even I messed that up just a little bit. Remember, those values have to be opposite of what's in the equation, and then using your slope for point slope. Okay? So that's slope-intercept and point slope. Now, standard form is easy to find, but it requires a little bit of algebra, or easy to graph, but it requires algebra. So first you have to find your x and y intercepts by setting your x or y equal to 0, so really both, and then solving for the other letter. Then you're going to put each point on its respective axis. So you're going to put the x-intercept on the x-axis, the y-intercept on the y-axis, and then you'll draw a line between those 2 points. So you can see I graphed an x-intercept and a y-intercept on here, and I just drew my line in between them. The hard part there is finding the intercepts. So let's take a look at this equation. So if I have 3x plus 2y equals -10, the first thing I have to do is put in 0 for each of those letters and solve to find its intercept. So for x-intercept, I'm going to plug in y equals 0. So where the y spot is, I'm going to put a 0. So 3x plus 2 times 0 equals -10. For my y-intercept, I want the x value to be equal to 0. So 3 times 0 plus 2y equals -10. Then I'm going to go through and solve for each of those letters. Solve for x over here, solve for y over here. And I get the x value is about -3.3, and the y value is -5. So on the x-axis, I'm going to put a dot at about -3.3, and on the y-axis, I'm going to put a dot at -5, and then I just connect those 2 dots with my line. So again, the hard part there is finding those intercepts, but once you have them, you just put them on the x and y-axis and draw a line between them. All right. Last thing we're going to talk about graphing today is absolute values. So if you remember, absolute value function looks like y equals absolute value bars, x, and that graph is a V shape where the vertex is at 0, 0, and the slope of each side is 1 and -1. So that's your basic function. We talked about all the different ways to transform or change that function and how that might change its equation. So I'm going to go through all of those. But remember, each of those transformations, there could be multiple, and you'll see that in the example. Okay, so let's start with our shifts. So if we want to move left, right, up, or down, we're going to add or subtract a value to that x amount. Sometimes we're going to add inside the parenthesis or the absolute value bars. Sometimes we're going to move on the outside or add on the outside. So if you take a look to shift left, you're going to add inside the absolute value bars, and that's really the opposite. So normally we think left is negative, but it's going to be a plus amount this time. If you want to shift right, you're going to subtract inside your absolute value. And again, that's the opposite. Normally we think -3 is to the left, but this is really to the right. If I want to shift up or down, then I'm going to add for up on the outside of my absolute value bars or subtract for down on the outside of my absolute value bars. So left, right, up, down, there's all the values that you're going to do, adding or subtracting. Okay. If we want to turn our V shape upside down, we're simply going to add a negative sign in front of those absolute value bars, and that's going to take our V shape from right side up to upside down. And then finally, if we want to change by stretching or shrinking, basically if we want the V shape to become smaller, skinnier, or wider, then we're going to stretch or compress that amount, and we do that by adding a number in front of our absolute value of x. So we're going to add an a value, and remember, this does not include that negative sign because the negative sign does something else. So if the number by itself is greater than 1, then our V shape is going to be stretched out and it's going to be much skinnier, and you're going to count up higher and to the right or left less. If your a value is between 0 and 1, that means it's a decimal or a fraction less than 1, then our V shape is going to be shrunk or compressed, and it's going to be much fatter. So it's going to be much a wider V shape, and you're going to go over a lot more than you're going to go up or down for each side. All right, so let's take a look at one of these. So here's my equation. Y equals -2, absolute value of x minus 1 plus 1. Sorry about that. So here's what each part does. So the negative part turns it upside down. 2 makes it skinnier, so you'll see the slope change. The x minus 1 on the inside says move to the right. Remember, that's opposite. And then the plus 1 says move up. That is not opposite. So the first thing I did was graph my new vertex point by moving up, left, down, or right. In this case, it's just right and up. So I went from 0, 0, which would normally be where my vertex is, up 1, right 1, and that gave me my new vertex point. Then I used my 2 and the negative sign to graph my new slopes. So I went down 2 because it was negative, and then to the right 1 and to the left 1. And then from each of those points, I went down 2, right 1, down 2, left 1, etc., etc. And so that gave me each of my V-shaped sides for that graph. Okay? All right, so that was graphing lines and absolute values. Next time we'll graph quadratic equations.